Hi, my name is Brittany J Jones. In this video, I am going to be showing you how to gather fabric using yarn. One of the most common ways to gather fabric is to use 2 rows of basting stitches. However, if you want to save a little bit of your thread, and if you have some yarn, dental floss, twine, any of these types of things at home, you can also use these to gather up fabric. This method is recommended for mid to heavyweight fabrics because using 2 rows of basting stitches on a heavyweight fabric will most likely pop and break. This method is really easy, and I'll be honest, I'm thinking about using this method moving forward for all of my garments. The key to using yarn to gather is instead of just lengthening out our stitch length, we're going to lengthen out our stitch length and also our stitch width. We want to make sure that we have a width that's wide enough to go over the yarn or cord or dental floss or twine or whatever you're going to be using. So you need a long stitch length and you also need a long stitch width. This is where I'm going to recommend that you look at your sewing machine manual. Because we all have different sewing machines, your manual will tell you exactly how to lengthen and widen your stitch. This is going to be a fun, detailed tutorial. Let's get started. For this demo, I'm going to be using some yarn here, and I've cut the yarn to be longer than the piece of fabric that I'm going to gather because, again, it needs to act as the loose thread tails that we would leave on our machine. We're just going to use it for yarn. We also want it to be inside of our seam allowance, our 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, but you don't want it too close to the edge. For this, I would recommend being at about 1/2 of an inch. And for this one, instead of doing a straight stitch, we're going to use a zigzag stitch, and we're going to put it on the longest stitch that we have so that it goes over our yarn or dental floss or any type of string that you have that's not just thread. So I'm just going to grab a pin. I'm going to place it right here about 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do a figure 8 with my yarn to lock it in place here. Because again, I don't want the yarn to just be moving about. I want it to have a little bit of security when I go to the sewing machine. So let's go ahead and stitch this now. To adjust my machine, I'm going to select my zigzag stitch, and I'm going to lengthen out the stitch as long as it can go. You can see it getting longer here. Now that you have your stitch length lengthened out, you also need to adjust the width of your stitch for the zigzag stitch. So I would go ahead and test out your zigzag stitch over your yarn just to make sure that you are clearing it. Now that you have your yarn here, you want your yarn to be centered right on the center of your presser foot. Now all of our presser foots are different. Mine have a little mark right here indicating the center. Yours may not, but just make sure that you are centered on your presser foot. When you're doing this, it's a lot of things to look at, so definitely take your time. You want to make sure that you're keeping your raw edge lined up with the seam allowance, whether you're sewing directly on your 5/8 of an inch or whether you're sewing at 1/2 inch or something smaller. You have to keep your eye here as well as on the center to making sure that you are clearing and that your yarn isn't moving. So take your time and go slow to make sure that you are in fact going around the yarn. Here's a look at my zigzag stitch over my yarn. So now I'm just going to go ahead and pull the yarn to gather up my fabric. Again, make sure that you have one side of the yarn secured. Once you have it gathered up to where it needs to be, I would take another pin and do another figure 8, or you could also tie it in a knot. We just want to secure it until we attach it to the other pattern piece that we're going to be sewing it to so that nothing comes undone. Once you have pulled up on your cord, and I'm going to use this fabric here because again, you could be attaching to a waistband, you could be attaching to a bodice. Once you have it pulled up to match what you're going to be attaching it to, and as you can see, I pulled a little too much, so I'm just going to let some of the stitches out here. Before we pin it in place though, you just want to distribute your gathers to make sure that everything is even. You don't want it to be one section full of gathers and then the other sections not so much. So just take your time and just distribute your gathers evenly. Once you have them distributed, then you can take your fabric piece. Again, this could be a waistband, it could be a bodice. You want to go ahead and pin it together right sides facing and pin it in place. Now once you have pinned your pattern piece to the fabric that you have gathered, now you want to go ahead and stitch it in place. For this, we're going to put our stitch length back on a straight stitch for a regular stitch, and we're going to begin stitching from one side, back stitching at the end and back stitch at the other end. And since we did not stitch directly on our seam line, we should not hit the zigzag stitch while we are stitching. Let's go ahead and stitch it now. Okay, I went ahead and cut off my excess yarn, so my yarn is in here now. However, if we did this correctly, we should just be able to pull our yarn and it just come out smoothly. So let's go ahead and grab the yarn and give it a pull. And your gathers are still intact. So now for your garment, you would follow along with the remaining directions to go ahead and construct the project that you are making.